This is The Red Line, where we interview geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. This week's episode is a bit of an emergency broadcast. You see, about a week ago, one of my long-term contacts in Russia, an intelligence officer working for the MOD, gave me a call out of the blue. Now, on that phone call, he spent most of the time complaining about his conditions at work, pretty livid about being passed over for a promotion time and time again. And by the end of the phone call, he opened up that he was looking to leave Russia once and for all, hoping we might be able to do something to help him. He informed me that in exchange for getting him across the border, he would send us a packet of information that he just smuggled out of a Russian testing facility not far outside Kasputin Yar. That packet being blueprints for a brand new Russian weapon system. For obvious reasons, we're not going into details about what we did, but a few days later, our friend arrived safe and sound into Georgia, from where he would fulfill his end of the bargain. And so 2 days ago, we received our Russian packet. What he'd smuggled across the border with him were the designs, blueprints, and supporting information for a weapon system that's finished its testing and is likely about to enter service with the Russian MOD. So in an effort to understand these plans better and bring all of this to light, we thought it best to bring in some special experts and give them access to these new blueprints, so they can analyze what kind of weapon this is, what this kind of weapon's capable of, and how much of an impact it's likely to have on Russia's current battlefields. So joining me today for this one is the renowned Russia analyst Mark Galeotti, a senior associate fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, the executive director of MIAC Intelligence, a long-time Russian security analyst, and the host of the amazing In Moscow's Shadow podcast. As well as our second guest, the distinguished weapons analyst Eric Gomez, who specializes in missiles and nuclear delivery systems. And it's a pleasure to have both of you here with us today. Now, for the sake of the audience, I think it's probably important for us to give a bit of a description of the weapon system we're currently looking at. This weapons platform here appears to be a semi-mobile artillery system, measuring approximately 15 meters in length, 10 meters in width, and standing at about 15 meters in height. It features a rectangular base with wheels for transportation, as well as a centrally mounted projectile launch assembly that's approximately 12 meters in length. Now, from these documents, we can also see the system is a crew serve system, with an operational team comprised of around 6 personnel, these being 1 fire control commander, 1 master gunner / artillery systems engineer, 2 fire control operators, and 2 ammunition technicians, 6 people being required, as it is a fairly large system. Now, Mark, you've been looking at the Russian military for a very long time now. Does it surprise you that it's within the artillery that Russia appears to be putting all of its technological effort?
We've got to realise that the focus tends to be on the Ukrainian military's capacity to innovate and adapt. The Russians have also been adapting, and in many ways, this shows many of the lessons of the Ukrainian war. And it meets the needs of the current Russian military, which we have to acknowledge is not the same as the Russian military in January 2022, before this invasion. It is an example of the kind of adaptation that the Russian military is going through at the moment.
Now, with both of us having now sat down and read some of the after-action reports we've received about this weapon system, the analysis seems to be that when it has been deployed against contemporary fortifications, these weapons have proven themselves capable of bringing down enemy defenses time and time again. Now, you've obviously been through the reports and you've read how this system's been used in a number of different scenarios. Do you want to take us through one of the after-action reports where these weapons were used against Kiev's forces?
Well, Kiev itself has been victim to this weapon. And in this case, yes, it was able to quite easily, unfortunately, penetrate the defenses of Kiev, creating breaches that then the attacker can exploit to the fullest. This is its real value, is precisely in terms of clearing space.
Now, while Russia does have plenty of artillery systems already in operation, this one here is one that particularly concerns me, as it massively stands out from anything else the Russians are currently operating. As from a design and tactical employment perspective, the system exhibits characteristics that make it both lightweight, modular, and economically scalable, which when combined with the fact that it also reportedly works as a multi-caliber precision launcher, capable of executing both short-range surface-to-surface and surface-to-air attacks, sets it up for this system to be a cheap, maneuverable, and deadly artillery platform that catapults Russia ahead in economic efficiency. Because whilst also being very cheap to produce, the price tag coming in at only a tiny fraction of the cost of a HIMARS, this weapon system also appears to exhibit minimal thermal or electromagnetic emissions, effectively rendering it nearly untrackable by NATO's conventional ISR assets. From an ISR perspective, what we effectively have here is a stealth artillery system. So, Eric, outside of Washington or Kiev parachuting in commandos that can locate these weapon systems and apply termite directly to the firing mechanism, what systems do the West currently operate that are actually capable of detecting a weapon system of this variety?
It sounds like you need to have eyes on this thing in order to have any chance of seeing it. You just can't do it with the tools we have.
So, Mark, if I'm reading these blueprints correctly, the system also advertises itself as being completely impervious to all of NATO's jammers and electronic warfare capabilities. What impact do you think that's likely to have on the battlefield?
This is something that we've all had to learn, is the degree to which electronic warfare, which is after all an area in which the Russians excel, has become so crucial to the modern battlefield. In some ways, there's two ways of trying to adopt a new approach to that. Either you try and out-tech. In other words, you get even better, even more expensive, even smarter, and some would say even more fragile systems, bringing in AI and all the other sort of panoply of modernity. Or you go the other way. You go to aggressively simple in precisely a way that does not actually leave you vulnerable. You cannot be spoofed. You cannot be jammed. You cannot have your warheads redirected. So in this respect, this does cause a problem. I mean, except when we're talking about the good old Mark I eyeball, it's actually going to be quite difficult for the weapon systems detection and targeting arrays that we have used in the West and increasingly being supplied to the Ukrainians to be able to spot this until after it's fired.
So from looking at these plans, the other thing that really stood out to me here was the fact that rather than using the standard 48 N6E3s or 9M 96E2s, missiles that Moscow has found increasingly limited over time, the associated munitions for this system appear to utilize a non-standard legacy caliber projectile, one that's not been observed in active service with the Russians for quite a while now. And from what I can read here, Russia appears confident that it secured a guaranteed supply of the materials required to make these weapons from Iraq and Estonia. Now, with one of those sharing a direct border with Russia and the other sharing a direct border with Iran, how difficult will it be to actually prevent these materials from reaching the Russians?
Sanctions are, in some ways, an inefficient tool. And in particular, the Russians are going to be doing everything they can to grow up their own capacity to provide these. So in some ways, the imports are likely to be just simply a temporary stopgap. The same way as we saw with, for example, the Shahed drones from Iran. They were importing them while they were building up their own indigenous capacity to provide them.
So part of the genius of the Russian system here lies in Moscow's decision to construct much of the weapon's main framework not out of heavy, expensive, quite difficult to transport steel, but instead actually out of wood. As by switching to wood for the majority of the framework, it not only drastically lowers the cost of production, allowing for more of these systems to be fielded using the same budget, but it also severely limits the probability of someone hacking into it from long range. It lowers the overall weight of the system and therefore the fuel usage required for its transportation, allowing for the possibility that if Russia were to ship even just a handful of small components to the front lines, there is a possibility these weapons could be built and constructed right there at the front lines, and in turn freeing up massive chunks of Russia's logistics system. Now, I don't want to panic anyone listening in from Ukraine or listening in at home, but how much of this kind of wood ready for these systems does Russia currently have access to?
Well, the thing is, obviously, Russia has huge swaths of forests all across the tundra regions of Siberia. And in that context, it's worth noting, after all, that China is one of the main importers of Russian wood, which carries with it the potential that we're actually talking about technology transfer as much as we are just simply about raw materials being moved. But to go back to this point about precisely the logistics, if you have a weapon system that to a large extent you can construct in situ from materials which are available to you there and then, you take away one of the key approaches that the Ukrainians have been using with their precision-guided systems and especially their drones, which is exactly to interdict Russian supply lines. So again, this is a way in which actually that will no longer become a viable tactic.
With these systems having such a potential to be a real game changer on the battlefield, I'm fairly sure there are probably people listening at home who are going to have concerns that NATO powers could fall behind in this field. Thinking across the militaries of NATO, can you think of a single army actually fielding any of these kinds of weapons at the moment?
No, as near as I can tell, there are a few specialist locations, like the Royal Armoury in the UK, which are still able to contemplate these approaches. But it is something that will have to be completely retooled from scratch as far as most NATO countries are concerned.
So, Eric, I'm going to bring you back in now, as your speciality is with nuclear weapons and missile launcher systems. Now, as we can see from the blueprints we're looking at here, the Russians are claiming this system has an incredible maximum range of up to 32,000 centimeters. Now, at that longer distance, would you classify this as a short-range or long-range delivery system?
Well, this system exploits a treaty gap incredibly well. There's lots of limitations on strategic delivery systems currently hanging on between the US and Russia, but the extreme range of this system means that it's not covered by any existing international agreement to prohibit or limit its use and construction. The only saving grace of this might be that how jealous are the Russians of keeping this to themselves, that they have something that fits into this niche in NATO defenses, and hopefully they will not want to share it with any of America's other potential adversaries like China.
So, looking at the system's capabilities, do you think Russia could look to use this weapon as a nuclear delivery system, utilizing this unjammable stealth artillery system to deliver nuclear strikes tens of thousands of centimeters away?
Almost anything can be a nuclear delivery system if you try and believe hard enough. And I also wouldn't limit this to nuclear. What's stopping them from putting a biological agent in this system and using its stealth to maneuver it somewhere where we couldn't interdict it at all? The dual use or triple use applications of this thing should be taken very, very seriously by Western leaders. I think we got to bring back the napalm. Time to deny the Russians their defense industrial base and start torching some forests.
So, Mark, whilst I definitely agree with Eric's brave statements here, I do worry that even if we are able to get rid of all the wood in Russia, that Moscow may still be able to access its required materials elsewhere. In fact, one of my biggest fears here is that within the genius of this plan, Russia could be sending their operators into the West ahead of time, with those operators then going off to plant trees within our countries, so that when the invasion does start, those military-grade trees could then be cut down and be used to build these weapons behind our very front lines. In fact, some of those trees may even be already growing today. You've known Russia and its intelligence services for a long time. Do you think that is something they could look to do, planting these trees in advance of the big attack?
One thing we do know about the Russians is they have a tendency to plan long term. If you are willing to, in effect, plant your illegal agents in another country and allow them to build themselves up to the point where they might be useful assets in 10 years' time, why could you not plant other assets?
So, Mark, since I know you can read Russian fluently, and we've been able to express to our audience how deadly serious this weapon is, can you go through the report and reveal to us the name that Moscow has given this deadly weapon?
Well, this is an interesting point, because at first when one looks at the blueprints, again, it's largely known by various code designations. But towards the end, it does let slip the actual name. And they're calling it the trebuchet.
The trebuchet. Europe's most deadly siege weapon throughout the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Mark, I don't want to sugarcoat this for our audience anymore. But now that the Russians have access to these medieval trebuchets, are any of NATO's pre-1600s castles or forts safe at this point in time?
Let's be honest, if Russia chooses to go medieval on NATO, I don't think any of them are. I mean, how many of them really have been reconfigured? How many of them actually are in the kind of condition that is necessary to be able to face this terrifying weapon?
And Eric, your final thoughts?
And I am terrified for the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Game over, man. Game over.
So by now, I hope most of you have clicked on. But if not, this was our 2025 April Fool's episode. as after last year and all the great feedback we got on that one, including the people who emailed me halfway through the episode telling me they'd seen no reports of San Marino and troops moving to the Italian border, we thought it would be a lot of fun to do another one for this year, showcasing a weapon system that was cutting edge and has attacked Kiev, even if those labels are probably better applied back in 1246. But in any case, I want to give a massive shout out to both my staff, as well as Eric Gomez and Mark Galeotti, both of which have been great friends of the show and volunteered themselves to jump on this absolutely crazy little piece. We cannot thank them enough for jumping on this one and highly recommend you go check out their work outside of this. So from all of us here at the show, happy April Fools. Hopefully you enjoyed the piece, and we cannot wait to try and fool you again in 2026. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.